Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second video for the class. This is going to be about Harrison's short bit about the bodies of the Britons in the late 16th century and Ralph Waldo Emerson's chapter on race from his book, English Traits from the mid-19th century. So when you're reading Harrison's on the general constitution of the body of the Britons, you may have had some difficulties with the language. But don't make the mistake of assuming that it's Old English. It's not. It's chronologically old, but technically it's modern English. It's modern English because it's pronounced roughly like our English is pronounced today. And the grammar is quite similar to modern English grammar. English can be divided into Old English technically, into Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. And Old English you can't read unless you have a lot of training. Middle English is like Chaucer, and we're going to be reading some Middle English in this class. You can actually read that without a lot of training. And then Modern English is things like, well, Shakespeare through to the present day. So specifically, Harrison is writing in the Elizabethan era. That's when Queen Elizabeth I was queen. So that's one of the things you're up against. There's also a printing feature, which is a little unusual, and that's that V's and U's are indistinguishable. So if you see a word that looks like perceiva, it's actually perceive. And that's just an artifact or a symptom of the way that Latin printing and Latin handwriting tended not to distinguish U's from V's. And so with that in mind, you have to understand that literacy training in England really from the Middle Ages through, I'm not entirely sure when, maybe up through at least the 18th century, was in Latin. If you're going to learn to read, you would learn to read Latin. And English was a secondary thing because it wasn't as valued as a language. And this certainly would have been the case for Harrison. So he actually is going to assume that his readers at least know enough Latin that they can recognize a little quotation and translate it on the fly. So you're going to encounter some quotations in that. I'll have them available as translations next Tuesday. But for example, one of them is Galli ridendo fidem frangunt, which literally means the French laughing break faith, or that is to say, the French are sociopaths. Harrison has got some serious problems with the French. And one of the chief things he's trying to do in this chapter is to argue for the superiority of the English to the French. The key thing here is that he's making a kind of climatic model of race. He's arguing that geography and the relative heat and relative distance from the equator determines the bodily and therefore the kind of national or racial characteristics of a people. And one of the things he's drawing on is the notion of the four humors. So I would like you to look up those four humors. What are they and what are their chief characteristics? So pause the video and look that up for me. Okay, so now I'm assuming that you're back. The other exercise for Harrison I'm going to ask you to do is to use the Oxford English Dictionary to help you understand some of his vocabulary, because if you don't understand the meaning of what he's saying, then you can't understand what he's saying or what's at stake. The Oxford English Dictionary is a historical dictionary of the English language. Many people make the mistake of assuming that it's the most authoritative record of what a particular English word means now. That may or may not be the case. There may be better dictionaries for what a word means right now, but the Oxford English Dictionary is a very good dictionary for giving you the history of a word. So if you want to know what a word might have meant to a writer in the 18th century, then you're going to look at the Oxford English Dictionary. You'll look at when this work that you're reading was written. You'll look at the dates for various words and the variety of definitions, and you'll eventually settle on the one that's probably correct. Some words have transformed a great deal over the course of the history of the English language. Silly, for example, is a word that initially meant something like holy or innocent, and gradually, of course, came to mean foolish. So we have access to the Oxford English Dictionary through the Brooklyn College Library. You can access it through the databases. And so I'm going to ask that you pause right now and that you access the Oxford English Dictionary in your browser or on your phone or however else you want to. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you're in that. You figured it out because you can't do the next exercise without being in the OED, which is the short form talking about the Oxford English Dictionary. So here are some sentences from Harrison. And in the Google form, which I'm going to produce maybe tomorrow, I'm going to have you tell me what you think these words mean in this context by paraphrasing what it is that Harrison is saying. So here are 3 sentences, and I've underlined the particular words that I want you to look up in the OED, and I want you to try to decide what it is you think Harrison means by these words. Remember, he's writing in the 1580s. So definitions that first become current, say 100 years later, are not going to be relevant. You need to understand these words historically. So he writes, as concerning the stomachs also of our nation in the field, they have always been in sovereign admiration among foreign princes. So I'm going to want you to look up stomachs. Next sentence. Whereas contrariwise, such as dwell towards the course of the sun, that is, towards the equator, are less in stature, that is, they're shorter, weaker of body, more nice, delicate, and so on. What does he mean by nice? I don't really think he means like the sort of person who would be, you know, you maybe want to have watch your cat or something like that. And then he accounted most wise in politic, but can most of all dissemble. So you might want to look up dissemble because that's probably an unusual word to you. But I want you to look up accounted because it's an unusual spelling of a word that you might encounter in modern English. And then this word politic, which does have a really distinct meaning, which is really not much like how we use the word nowadays. Okay, so that's your assignment basically for the Google form, and be sure to do that. So here are some general interpretive questions I'm going to ask you to think about with Harrison. So he's an Englishman, and he's trying to understand what it is about him that makes him an Englishman. What are the particular characteristics of his people? And he's a learned man, so he's reading all this, these learned treatises that, well, written by people who lived outside of Britain, people like Aristotle, who was Greek, Alexander ab Alexandro, who's from Naples, Italy, or Cicero, who's from Rome, Italy. These are not Englishmen writing about the English. These are Italians and Greeks, and they have often quite negative opinions about the Englishmen. So he is confronted with a body of scholarship that tells him that he's not as valuable as these writers think of themselves. And so that's something that's quite interesting. So maybe let's talk about that on Tuesday. Also, I'm asking you for the really big question, which is, what are some of the ways that this text is suspicious about the advantages of intelligence? So he admits that people who live further south are more clever than people who live in the north, but he's not really quite sure that's a good thing. Is intelligence actually good? So think about that. I apologize for the sirens, but you know, it's Brooklyn. So the next thing I want to offer up, hold on, I just need to pause. No, here we go, we're good. Another thinker who is interesting for looking ahead to these stories of racial transformation, a fellow named Samuel Stanhope Smith, who was an early president of what would become Princeton University. So I'd like you to pause this video, look him up, read the Wikipedia entry on his theories, and just get a sense of what he's about. Okay, so I'm assuming you've done that. And he's not just interested in climate, however, is a key feature of race and racialization. Remember, that's very important, climate, both to Harrison and also to the writer from the Anglo-African magazine from the 1850s. So he also has a story that I'd like you to read from his work, Essay on the Causes and Varieties of the Complexion and Figure in the Human Species. And I've got a URL here. I'll upload the PowerPoint to Blackboard, so you can click on that if you like. And I just want you to read a few pages in it, pages 173 to 76. Skip the footnotes. It's mostly footnotes, so there's really not a lot of reading, but it's a story of a Native American teenager who is brought to Princeton and taught to read Greek and Latin. And as a result of this, Samuel Stanhope Smith says, he basically becomes lighter skinned. and his face starts to look less Native American and more like the face, well, of an Englishman. So that's a bizarre and strange story, and certainly fictionalized, but it tells us something about the belief of how race worked, at least for a figure like Samuel Stanhope Smith, who is less committed to race as a fixed characteristic. So Jefferson, of course, is committed, on the other hand, to it as an absolutely fixed characteristic, and Jefferson and Stanhope Smith were contemporaries. It's important to recognize. So with Emerson, English traits, race, I want you to look up who he is. He's a very important figure in American writing. So just pause, look him up, read a little bit about him, just get a sense of who he is. That I want to tell you. Okay, so you've done that. The chief arguments in this work, because it's strange and you may not have picked up on this, are the following. First off, of course, that the English are the dominant and best race. Emerson is an American, but he thinks of himself and also a dominant group of Americans as descended from the English. It's basically English in all but nationality. And so Emerson's going to say the English are the best. And at this time, the English have such an enormous empire, you could certainly say they're the most powerful. But he's interestingly, in his thinking about the English race and trying to define what they are, he says they're not the best because of the purity of the race, but because they're a mixture. That is, they're a mixture of three different races, what he believes are races. The Celts, that is the Irish, and the Scots and the Welsh, mixture of the Anglo-Saxons and the Germans, and also the Norse and the Vikings. And then he goes on to talk about the way that these three different groups have contributed to the English racial character. So they comprise a mixture, and it's that mixture that gives them strength. And so it's weirdly an argument about race that's not really about racial purity, even though it's basically a racist argument. Also, he's going to argue that the more civilized the people are, the less race matters. So he's going to argue, first of all, the English have a race, that race is mixed, but that ultimately they're so civilized that they are not controlled by their race. What the implication is that people who are less civilized are more dominated by their so-called racial characteristics. So basically, white people have freedom, English people have the most freedom, and people who aren't white, and so in his mind, that means Black people, Jews, and Arabs have less freedom because they're more dominated by their racial characteristics. So this is a very common set of beliefs and still influential. So I want to offer up one of the intellectual forebears of Emerson, someone he's drawing on. And again, I'll upload this to the PowerPoint to Blackboard, so you can click on this URL and read this. This is Robert Knox in his work, The Races of Men, which Emerson cites on the first page of your reading. And Robert Knox is whom Emerson calls an ingenious anatomist, was Scottish. He lived in Edinburgh. He was interested in trying to find the sort of most ideal specimens of various anatomical models, trying to find a skeleton that seemed like the best representation of the human figure or the white figure, etc. And he did this through grave robbing, not himself, but he had his employees, freelancers really, go out and dig up graves and get them bodies. And eventually people found this out, and also some of the people he was hiring were murdering people. So just to skip the grave robbing part. So they were hanged, and Robert Knox, being a rich man, of course, did not go to jail. He just went to exile in London, and no longer being able to practice medicine, he wrote books instead. And one of his books, The Races of Men, makes this argument about the Celtic character. So I'm going to ask you to read this. Pause and read what he has to say about the Celts. He's talking about the Irish. So read it for just a moment. Okay, so now you've unpaused. And at the time, the English are a colonial power in all of Ireland. That's not the case today, at least not in all of Ireland. But he's going to try to justify this. And he is going to say, ultimately, as a Saxon, and what he really means is as a white Englishman, I abhor all dynasties, monarchies, and bayonet governments. He's saying, as an Englishman, I prefer freedom. I want democracy, I want freedom, I want liberty. But this latter seems to me to be the only one suitable for the Celtic man. In fact, basically saying, I believe in democracy, I believe in freedom, but the only way that you can rule the Irish people is through force. That's the only thing they respect, because they have all these terrible characteristics. And I want you to identify those characteristics, because I think the way that he is negatively racializing the Irish has some bearing on identifying some of the features of racialization in the present day. These sorts of beliefs just tend to be repeated again and again, but about different people, right? But the sorts of beliefs are all often very much the same. So while the Irish were never enslaved in the modern era, still a lot of the language that's going to be used to negatively racialize other people was first practiced against the Irish and also against the Jews. With that in mind, and this is going to be something for the Google Forms, and this is the last slide, I'm going to ask you to pay particular attention to what Emerson says about Arabs, about Jews, and about Black people, whom he calls Negroes. You will write about this in the questionnaire, and we'll talk about that in class. The key passages are going to be on page 351 in Emerson, but there's also a sentence that he has about the crab. And just look for that word crab, look what he has to say about it, because it's super important to understanding how race works in Emerson. And that is the end of this video, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again next Tuesday.